June 1944, inside a captured French chateau, German headquarters buzzes with quiet confidence. On the tables, maps of the Atlantic coast, masterpieces of military detailing every beach, every tide, every possible route for an enemy tank. The strategy refined by Field Marshal himself is built on a central doctrine proven in countless war games. An invading army is most vulnerable in the first 48 hours. German command is certain they can throw the Allies back into the sea. Their entire plan hinged on a single question. They had answered exhaustively, where will the enemy land? But they had failed to ask a far more important one. This is not another story about the heroism on the beaches. It is the story of a colossal strategic blind spot. Battle for France would be decided not by soldiers alone, but by an industrial machine. The German high command could not comprehend a war won by spreadsheets, engineers, and factory workers thousands of miles away. Real question was never could the Germans have stopped the landings, but rather how did Germany's brilliant generals fail to see they were facing an enemy that could replace every man and every machine faster than they could be destroyed. To understand their fatal error, we must first examine the logic of their plan, a plan that on paper should have worked. By 1944, German military thinking had hardened into a formidable doctrine for defending Fortress Europe. This wasn't a simple wall, it was a sophisticated three-layered defensive system built on a century of wargaming and battlefield experience. The first layer was the crust, the Atlantic wall itself. This was the brutal physical barrier at the water's edge. Millions of tons of concrete shaped into bunkers and gun imp placements, their fields of fire interlocking below them. The beaches were seeded with steel obstacles, teller mines, and sharpened logs known as asparagus, all designed with a single purpose: to break the momentum of an initial assault, to inflict maximum casualties, and to turn the shoreline into a chaotic killing ground the moment the landing craft ramps came down. But the Germans knew the crust would eventually be breached. That's where the second layer came into play, the cushion. This was the immediate hinterland, the first few miles of French countryside behind the beaches. Here, any surviving Allied units, disorganized and separated from their officers, would be channeled into pre-sighted artillery zones and machine gun nests. The goal was to pin them down, to prevent them from consolidating into a coherent force, and to hold them in a state of extreme vulnerability. They would be an army without a foothold, trapped between the sea and the enemy. This setup led to the third and most critical component, the hammer. Held in reserve away from the coast were Germany's elite panzer divisions. The armored fist of the entire defensive concept was built around them. The logic was universally accepted. Military truth: invasion is a fragile, isolated entity. It is starved of heavy equipment, reinforcements, and supplies. An army fighting on a beach head is an army with its back to the water, its supply lines stretching across a hostile sea. The German high command calculated they had a window between 48 and 72 hours before the invaders could land enough tanks, artillery, and supplies to become a real threat. Within that window, the hammer would fall. The panzers would charge to the coast and annihilate the weakened, trapped enemy, pushing them back into the English Channel. It was a sound, logical, and lethal plan. The entire German war machine in the West was coiled like a spring, waiting for the signal, waiting for the enemy to step into the carefully prepared trap. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the signal came. The first reports arrived just after midnight, airborne landings, scattered, disorganized. It fit the profile perfectly. Then, as dawn broke over the English Channel, came of ships again expected at German 7th Army headquarters in Lille. The initial mood was tense but controlled. The Allied attack was unfolding exactly as their war games had predicted, but then the reports kept coming and the numbers began to swell. Beyond comprehension, a fleet wasn't just sighted off the Calvados coast. It was everywhere. Telephone lines crackled. With disbelief, reconnaissance pilots, breaking through the clouds, described not a naval force but a city on the sea. The map on the command table, once a tool of clarity, became a canvas of chaos. 5 major landing zones, not one or two paratroopers landing deep far beyond the cushion zone. The numbers escalated from dozens of ships to hundreds and then to the impossible. Nearly 7,000 vessels were crossing the channel. The meticulous German plan, designed to counter a precise surgical strike, was facing a flood. The 48-hour clock for the panzer counterattack had started, but the generals were paralyzed. Where was the main effort? Which beach was the priority? Their doctrine was built to defeat an army. But this wasn't an army, it was a nation, moving itself across the water. Conceptual framework of their defense shattered. The critical flaw in their thinking was laid bare. They had planned to fight the soldiers who got off the boats, assuming they would be a finite, vulnerable force. They were about to discover the soldiers were just the beginning. While German generals stared at maps, paralyzed by an invasion too large to comprehend, a different kind of army was already hitting the beaches. Their primary weapon wasn't the M1 or the Bren gun, it was the bulldozer. Within hours of the first wave, specialized units like the U.S. Navy, CBS, and the British Royal Engineers came ashore. Their mission wasn't to capture bunkers but to fundamentally re-engineer the French coastline under enemy fire on Omaha Beach, where the American infantry was pinned down and bleeding. Combat engineers used explosives to blast gaps in the shingle bank, creating crude exit ramps. Then the bulldozers came, armored against small arms fire, shoving aside wrecked vehicles and clearing paths off the beach. The high-pitched whine of their engines joined the symphony of war. Sound of construction amidst destruction. The battlefield was being transformed into a massive functioning port. These men weren't just clearing obstacles left by, they were building roads where there were none, leveling dunes and laying down steel matting to prevent trucks from sinking into the sand. The German defenders, peering from their bunkers, saw something that their military training, they were prepared to fight soldiers. They were not prepared to fight a construction project. The beach head was no longer just a target to be shelled, it was becoming a gateway, expanding and hardening with every hour. Meanwhile, 20 miles inland, the German hammer was failing to fall. The elite panzer divisions, the core of the entire defensive strategy, were stalled. Part of the delay was command chaos. Field Marshal was in Germany for his wife's birthday. Key commanders were at a war game simulation in Rennes, and in his remote headquarters himself refused to release the strategic reserves, convinced Normandy was a diversion for a larger attack at. But the most decisive factor was in the sky. It was completely, utterly owned by the Allies. For a German tank crew, daylight was a death sentence. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons, nicknamed by the Germans, circled like vultures any movement on a road. Single tank, a truck, a staff car, brought a screaming dive in a salvo of rockets and cannon fire. The panzers could only move at night, inching forward in darkness, hiding in forests. By day, the 48-hour window, the critical period where the hammer was supposed to smash the fragile beachhead, slammed shut. The invasion force was not being contained, it was growing, metastasizing. Then came the reports that broke the German command's last connection to reality. Reconnaissance pilots risking their lives in the Allied-dominated airspace returned with unbelievable photographs. Off the coast of Insan, something impossible was taking shape. The Allies weren't waiting to capture the heavily defended port of. They were bringing their own ports with them. These were the harbors, gooseberries and phoenixes. They were the most audacious engineering feat of the war. Colossal concrete each the size of a building, were towed across the English Channel, and then sunk in place to create a massive breakwater floating piers, miles of them snaked from the shore out to docking heads where massive Liberty ships could unload directly for the German High Command. This was a moment of profound strategic shock. It violated every known rule of amphibious warfare. An army was supposed to seize a port. It wasn't supposed to bring one in its back pocket. This wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a logistical miracle that made a mockery of their entire defensive posture. The Allies weren't just supplying an invasion, they were building a permanent all-weather industrial base on the shores of France. With the artificial harbors in place, the trickle of supplies became a torrent. The numbers, when compiled, were an indictment of Germany's strategic blindness. By the end of June, just over 3 weeks after D-Day, the Allies had landed over 850,000 men, but the men were only part of the equation. With them came nearly 150,000 vehicles, tanks, jeeps, ambulances, and thousands upon thousands of trucks in over 570,000 tons of supplies, food, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, spare parts, mountain range of material. This was the industrial flood. It was a system designed for overwhelming, relentless build-up. Plans were already for the Red Ball Express, a continuous loop of truck convoys that would soon supply the armies racing across France, and, even more incredibly, engineers were preparing to lay Pluto, the pipeline, under the ocean to pump fuel directly from Britain to the front lines. The German soldier in his foxhole was fighting bravely against American and British platoon, but Germany as a nation was being defeated by an enemy that measured victory in tons per hour. Every tank they knocked out was replaced by 2 more. Every crate of ammunition they expended was answered by a shipload. They were fighting a battle of attrition against an opponent with seemingly infinite resources. For the German generals, the physical evidence was terrifying. The endless columns of trucks, the ships queued up at the artificial harbors, the skies black with Allied planes, but the true nature of their defeat wouldn't be found on a map or through a reconnaissance photo. It would be found in a dry intelligence summary, in the cold, hard calculus of industrial output that was just beginning to reveal itself. By the first week of July, that summary arrived on the desks of the German High Command. It was not a battlefield assessment, it was an autopsy of their strategy, written the cold, hard language of logistics. For the first time, analysts had consolidated the data and calculated the Allied rate of deployment. The numbers were catastrophic: an average of 28,000 men, 5,000 vehicles landing on the Normandy coast every single day. Suddenly, the entire premise of the Atlantic Wall defense crumbled. The German command had planned for a battle of annihilation to destroy a finite invasion force. The data proved they were not in a battle, they were on the losing side of a mathematical equation. Any tactical success was now irrelevant. A panzer commander could fight a brilliant action, destroy an entire Allied battalion, and it would not matter. The reports showed the Allies could replace every man and every vehicle from the sea within days. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting the combined industrial output of the United States and the British Empire, delivered on a relentless schedule. In this new war, the most powerful weapon was not a tank or a plane, it was the spreadsheet proving you could absorb your losses and keep coming. This terrifying realization at the top of the command chain was soon distilled for the commanders in the field into a single devastating chart. On July 19th, that chart was placed before Field Marshal Gunter, the man who had just replaced as commander-in-chief. West, there was no complex analysis, just 2 stark lines on a grid. The top line representing total Allied strength in Normandy climbed relentlessly day after day, a diagonal slash moving up, and to the right showing no signs of Slowing it was the visual representation of the industrial flood. The men, the tanks, the fuel, the endless tons of supplies, the bottom line was his own German combat power. It was a mirror image, a steep, agonizing decline. Each dip was a lost panzer, shattered battalion, a convoy that never arrived in that quiet headquarters. The war in France ended for not in a blaze of glory or a tactical blunder, but in the silent acceptance of an irrefutable fact. This was not a problem of strategy, it was a mathematical verdict. The graph proved that all the courage of his soldiers was now irrelevant. All their sacrifice was being fed into an equation where the outcome was already determined. He could fight brilliantly, his men could die bravely, and it would not change the trajectory of those two lines by single degree. The German command had spent years studying maps of the French coastline. Now they finally understood. They had been looking at the wrong map. All along we returned to that French chateau, to the German headquarters with its immaculate maps of the coastline. The men who planned the defense of Fortress Europe were not incompetent. Their calculations of tides, beach gradients, and kill zones for tanks were precise and professional. They had prepared for a sophisticated 20th century war of tactics, maneuver, and annihilation. Their fatal error was not one of military science but of imagination. They failed to comprehend they were facing an enemy fighting different kind of war altogether, a war of systems, of production, of overwhelming logistical force. Normandy landings were more than a battle, they were a paradigm shift. Real, a moment when modern warfare quietly became the domain of the industrial engineer and the supply chain manager, eclipsing the traditional art of the battlefield general. Victory was no longer just about how you fight, but about your fundamental capacity to sustain that fight. The German command had planned meticulously to defeat an army on the shore. Their fatal mistake was assuming that was all they were fighting. They had prepared to engage army of soldiers. They were not prepared and could never be prepared to wage war against the assembly line itself.